Okay, so React context, high level, just right before we jump into this. Why do we need context, or why do we like having context? It passes props. What's special about its prop passing ability? Yeah, you can pass them anywhere. You don't have to go down, down, down. You are passing them down, but you can skip a couple levels. You can send it right to the point that needs it. Context can be seen as a state management tool. So other tools, if you're not using context, or maybe you're using context with these, are things like Redux, RxJS, MobX. These are all different tools that go to solve the same issue. How do we put our state, or the thing that our application depends on, the data, in one location or a central location, and then get it to all the components of our site that needs access to it. And what's nice about that is if we update the context, our entire app that depends on that data also updates in reaction to it. So it keeps it clean. If there's a set state issue, we basically know what file to go look at for the issue. So I'm going to first create a context to manage some to-dos. I'm going to call it the to-do provider. Before we build this out, we're actually going to look at context in a step backwards. We haven't broken down context to its simplest form yet. It may help you understand more of what it's doing. So this is here. We'll come back to it. What I'm going to do is in index.js, I'm going to create a context here. And I'm going to extract the provider and the consumer out of the context. So react.create context, and I have a provider and a consumer. So if we weren't using a class component with context, this is all we get. We get these two properties, or these two components. So I will wrap my provider around my app. And then what is the one prop that every provider needs? Value, what to provide. So we're used to doing this within a class component, but this is what context does by itself. And actually, let me put this here. We're going to provide some data, which will be an object. So we'll just put data in here. And we are providing data to anything that would like to consume it. I'm going to make these available to other files, because now we're not going to build a higher order component. We're just going to import the consumer on the file that needs to consume and show you what that syntax looks like without building all these extra tools to help. But is there any questions about this setup? What's happening here, or what I've done here? Okay, so anything in app now has access to the provider. Well, let's say in app, I would like to display that data here, this data. So I need to pull in the consumer so I can consume whatever the provider is providing.
So if you don't pull in the consumer and just say props.data, you wouldn't have access to whatever the provider is providing?
Yep. I currently have no access to this. Even though it's being provided, I have to use this consumer component to get access to what this is actually providing, the value object. So in app, I'm just going to import consumer from the index.js file. Now I would like to use this data. I'd like to display the username here. So this is how the consumer would work without all the extra tools that we've been using. We just say consumer, and the consumer gives you the value as a callback function like this. Now within these two brackets, I have access to the value object and can use them as if the data exists right here. So the value has a dot username and a ._ID. So I will say display the value.username. And there's Joe. This is what context does on its own. It provides me a provider and a consumer component. I tell the provider what to provide via a value prop. And then I wrap the provider around the component or tree of components that possibly need access to it. That's why we're wrapping it up here above app, is we're saying anything app or below should have access to consume this. But we could wrap this even further down in our app if our whole app didn't need it. The consumer component gets access to this value object wherever we use it. So if I pulled in the consumer here and I call it, in between the tags, it calls a function and provides that value so that I can then use it in my JSX. But how much would you like to do this every time you need to consume? You have to write the consumer tags, you have to write brackets, you have to write a function, and then start using the data. It's a lot of extra work for each file. And is there any ability for me to change this? Can I reset username to an empty string? Or could I add more to a list of items? If this was maybe maintaining an array, could I add or change that array? What do we think? No, why can't I update this? Yeah, I need to tie it into something that React knows that it can be updated and changed and have methods. So that is why we've always been putting context inside of a class. Because by default, provider provides static data. It can't change. It doesn't come with any functionality for changing. It simply provides and the consumer simply consumes. But if the data we're providing is tied to state, then we can change it. The provider is still simply just providing, but because it's in a class, we can change it. Any questions on kind of the basic breakdown of context, what it's doing, the two parts we get? Okay. Well, then let's do it the way that we have been doing it. And I'm going to just comment this out down below because we don't feel like doing it this way. But let's keep the example alive. And we'll make a new app. What's different about consuming it this way versus the higher order component way? If I was using a higher order component, where would have this data showed up at? Where would this be available to me within the app component? If I had something like with data, where does this actually put the data? Anywhere you want, but if I'm doing it right here in app.js, how is app.js receiving it? Props, right? With the consumer, it's not a prop thing. It's just right here within this part of this div, consume the following, context and give me access to the value so I can use it here. So by using a higher order component, we put everything in props so we can cut out that and that. All we have to do is props.username, and it really slims down the syntax for every file that has to consume. So let's do that. And we're back to normal. All right, so now to the way that we've been doing context. We make a class component, and then we create our context. We'll just call it to-do context, react.create context. And then what do we have our class component return? To-do provider, this would be a recursive function call.
I think it's the provider.
Oh, the provider. Okay, that is correct. Yes, and we wrap it around children, and we still give it the value prop. Now, whatever I put in this value prop with, since I'm within the scope of a class, I have access to all the things the class creates and maintains, which means I can provide stateful values I can provide methods, and now these all have the abilities to change over time. The provider isn't maintaining or isn't doing any of this functionality, it's just providing it. And then we're consuming it where needed. So let's make a little state here. That is the React syntax for wrapping a component around another component. So this syntax right here allows me to export my to-do provider, import it here, and then wrap it around my app. And the app will be the props.children. Every component gets a props.children. You just don't use it unless you need to wrap your component around something else. But yeah, that's what it does. If we didn't write this, it wouldn't know to expect anything. And we could put, hello world, and this would be our entire application right here. We don't want that. We want to be able to wrap this around anything and have it all render. So this props.children, tell it, this is like saying there's a p tag in a div. P is the child of the div, but we're having to use component syntax since we're using functions, and that's what React works with. Okay, so we have to-dos. We will provide that as a value. It's still providing something static, but we can change it if we make methods that changes it. So we'll make a add to-do method that takes a new to-do and set state to update the to-dos to have everything that it previously had, brief state that to-dos, and adds in the new to-do. And then we'll provide that method as well. So add to do this dot add to do. Now
why do we have to have parentheses after brief state in line 14?
If we don't, then it doesn't know that this is an object. It thinks it's a function body and won't return an object. So if we didn't use this syntax, we'd have to say return the following object.
So the curly braces, it gets rid of the implicit return, even if it's on the same line.
Yep. And I'd still need another set of parentheses. So save yourself from all that extra, wrap it with an extra set of parentheses. And it knows that this is to return this object. Okay, so any questions on the provider setup or why we're using it within a class component? Okay, we're export defaulting it. We're not using hooks right now, so we need to create a way to use the consumer portion of this to actually provide or grab this value when needed. For this, we make a higher order method that we export called with whatever data it's providing. So we'll say with to-dos. And what does this function take as its primary argument? A function, which we'll call C for component. When we call with to-dos and give it a component, what does it immediately return? A function that can take props as a parameter. So if we weren't writing this with ES6, we're going to do this the fun way. We're going to do it with just function. So this function takes a component. It returns a function that can take props. And this function returns the to-do context consumer. Now, if you remember on the app.js, when I used the consumer, how did it provide me the value? I use it, what is this right here? What JavaScript data type? So this is an object, but this whole expression here. So it's a function, just with the fat arrows, it makes it kind of hard to see. So seeing this syntax now, when we use a consumer, it gives us the value as a function, but instead of just returning something like an H1 using the value immediately, we're saying return my component and give it everything from that value object. And since we're using this syntax, it puts the value object into props, because that's how you pass props in React. It's when you use the component, you put it right after the declaration of the usage of it. So that will get the value into it, but when we call this function, we may also be giving it props. So we want to make sure those are included as well. Is it more or less confusing using the function keyword versus the arrow keyword or syntax? They look just completely different. We're calling this function, takes a component, and it returns this. With the ES6 syntax, we'd have with to-dos, takes a component, returns a function that can take props, and that returns the to-do context.consumer with the same syntax in between. These are the exact same thing, there's two different syntaxes for writing it. Right, but now we've built the ability to provide and consume, so now we just need to use the parts where they need to be used. We need to put the provider above wherever or whatever components are going to need access to the data. So we'll import our to-do provider component. And we'll wrap it around the app. And then we need to tell which components we want to consume. So we'll import our with to-dos from context to-do provider. And export default our app with to-dos. When I call this function and give it app, what does it return? When I call this function and give it app, what does it immediately return? Returns a function, and this is like, I really had to wrap my head around this for a while. It immediately returns a function. So this is actually what we're exporting. We're saying export default, and then we call this function and give it our app component, and it returns this no-name function, but it remembers our app component for later, okay? So this file is now exporting a function with no name, basically, but it knows what component we've given it, so that when we call that function with no name, the rest of this process will execute. Well, where are we actually calling the function that I'm exporting here? Right there. Now, it looks like it's the same thing because I'm importing it as a name app. That's just because I chose to do that. What I'm actually calling here, when I'm using this is the syntax for calling a function in React. You know, if this wasn't React, we'd say sum and give it its props. But in React, we say this, and we give it its arguments. Same thing though, as far as JavaScript is concerned, after bundling and all that is done. So this is actually this function. So we can still pass props into it because we gave that ability. And it's going to immediately return our component, the app that we originally passed in, with all the value and all the props included, passed down to it. That makes it so we have it here. We can say props.todos.map for each to-do. Maybe give us the title. Now we haven't created any to-dos yet, so this won't work, but once we get there, it will. What did I break? Oh, I don't want to put H1s in an H1, that's awful. Something else is broken. Oh.
Closing tag for H1.
Yeah. Oh, that would do it. Yeah. Cool. Right, and that's the kind of review of context in its setup. Did that add any clarity? And if not, what can we look at? What can we talk about more to help with this? You can even say that line number doesn't look right, or and hopefully you're finding the more you use it, the more things click. That's really how you're going to get this, is just keep using it. But yeah, I could do this as a functional component if I wanted to use state instead of the component. It'd still look pretty similar. Work the same. Okay, well in that case,
I had a question. I just remembered. So consumer, is it? Do you think that it's a? What kind of component do you think it is? Do you think it's a class-based component? Or
yeah. That's actually a good question. I mean, not to say that you don't ask good questions. You ask great questions, but is provider and consumer class components? I wouldn't believe so, because they only provide static values that can't change. If they had state built into it.
I'm just curious because when you were writing it out manually, like if you go back to that page where you're saying
Oh, this one right here?
Yeah, like you say value that username. So I'm like wondering what happens behind the scenes. Does it say like this dot props dot or this dot this dot props, or is it saying like I mean how are you?
Yeah, it's wrapped around a function being called, giving the value from the provider. No, we have to look into that. I wouldn't believe they're classes though. They could be. Just with no state. So we're going to make a form here to be able to add to-dos, but we don't want to turn app into a class. We're not going to maintain our inputs here. We're going to make a render prop component that manages that for us, and then make our own little static form that uses the functionality. So just to get started, we're going to start off with building the static form, which I'll call to-do form. And our to-dos will have a title, and that, let's see. Title and description. Okay. All the clicks. Oh, I missed two of them. Embarrassing. Okay, so we have my static form. What do I mean? I've said this word a lot, and I don't think we've actually talked about it. What do I mean by static? Yeah, whenever you hear like static website, static, it means everything is there. Everything it needs is there. It's not going to be changing over time. If anything is changing over time, it's being provided by something else. This by itself, though, is just display and functionality being plugged into it. But these things are static. They're not dynamic. They're not placeholders for something. To-do form. All right, so now we need to build the functionality for this. And we're going to go inside of our shared folder to do this, because we would like to be able to use this component over and over again if needed. And we're going to create a form component. Kind of a tough question, but how come I do not need to import React when building a render prop component? Yeah, I'm not returning JSX. What am I actually going to return from a render prop component? Props, yes, yeah. It's going to return props, which is going to provide all the functionality that the actual display component needs to work. So we need to build into this the ability to maintain inputs, the handle change, the handle submit, so we can use it here and provide all this data to our form. Right, so if we were to write a form right in here, what would need to be in state? If this was our literal state for the to-dos, title description. So that's for context. So this is for the form, like the inputs. Yeah, we'd write this, title, description, but we want to be able to use this component for any form. So we can't hard code the input values. So what is a way that I could give the form the input values and have the state be that? What is a way I can give form data in React? How do you pass any data to a component? Yes, props. So we'll say you're going to maintain some inputs, and these inputs are going to come from props. Right, so now I'm not hard coding it. When I use this component, I'm going to tell it what inputs to set state as. So I can use this as many times as I want with as many different inputs as I want, and it will work the same. Well, what else do we need functionality-wise for form? Methods, handle change, and handle submit. So first, the handle change. What do we need from the event? There are two things we need from the event.target. Name and value, okay? And then we set state. But if we're thinking for a moment, what is going to be inside of my state object? What is inputs going to be? What data type? It's going to be an object of inputs. And React is notoriously good at updating state, but if we put nested objects in state, it's going to erase anything we don't keep updated every time you're typing. So when we're creating a render prop form, we have to include previous state with this set state. Okay, so we're going to say update the state object. Well, what part of state are we updating? Inputs. Cool. And inputs is an object, so we're going to say maintain the following properties of inputs. First, give me everything that inputs had previously. So I'm not erasing anything. If they've been already typed in title, I don't want title to disappear when they're typing in description. So I'm saying maintain the title they were just typing, and then update the appropriate thing that they're typing in. Maintaining title, updating description. So that's where it changes a little bit. In our handle change, we have to account for this nested object and maintain the previous inputs while they're typing. Any questions on the handle change? We'll follow the logic through once we use this, but handle submit will prevent default. But what do we want handle submit to do? Update state, yeah. Update this state. Maybe reset this, but yeah, our handle submit needs to do possibly many things, depending on the form it's for. One could be adding a to-do, but we could also be using this for signing up or logging in. So this handle submit has to be able to call any function we give it. So how could we give our own function to form and have it call it here? First, how do I give data to a component? Just like I gave inputs. Props. So I'll say call this.props.submit. This doesn't exist, but I'm going to give it a prop called submit that's going to be the function I want this handle submit to call. So this is actually a callback function. I'm going to pass it into this component as a prop, and it will call it whenever I use the handle submit. This is why this can now be, you know, add to do or edit to do. These are all things I could pass in, but to make sure it's dynamic, I can pass anything in. I'm just going to call it as a prop name, and then I'll pass in the function it needs to call.
What do you think about providing that submit functionality, like as a second argument to handle submit? E comma and then I don't know, submit or something.
Yeah, you could do it that way too. It's just going to be a little bit more syntax on your form, but that could work. When we call submit, typically in a handle submit, what do we usually pass into it? Our inputs. Usually it's like this.state.title, this.state.description, but now we have a this.state.inputs. That is all the inputs. So we'll just pass that in. And then we want to reset this to an empty strings again, so it resets the form. So we could then set state to make inputs this.props.inputs. The original inputs we passed in, all the empty strings, and this will reset our form. The goal and one of the big difficulties with render prop components is nothing is hard coded, right? Everything is a dynamic placeholder for what we're going to pass into it. That's why it can be a little hard to read. Well, one of the reasons it's hard to read.
So did you come up with this thing, like this particular version of render props?
I don't think so. Might have been Ben. I redid it with hooks, but Ben did this with render props.
So this inputs
It's not. This is not a reserved word. This is not a reserved word. These are all the props that we've chosen to call it this when we use this component later. But once we use it, hopefully it'll tie a little bit more of this together. But now we have everything. We have the inputs, we have the methods. So what do we want this component to return? One more prop. This.props.render. And now this is a reserved word in React. This.props.render works a special way. It makes sure that the data being provided follows the same life cycle that React uses. Well, this is going to be a function that is called and provides an object. And this object will contain everything that needs to be given to whatever's using this component. So we'll pass in the inputs. We'll pass in the handle change. And the handle submit. And then we've exported it. So let's put a pin in this, go use it, and then follow the logic through. So in my app, I will pull in both my form render prop component and my static to-do form that needs to use the functionality from that component. So first I'm going to call form because I need this to generate all the content and then give it to my to-do form. So I will say form. Now form needs 3 props, and we know what these are because we wrote them. Well, I guess I know what they are because I wrote them, but what are the 3 props we've told form to expect?
Inputs.
Inputs, look at that. What else? No.
Submit.
Where else am I saying props? Inputs, submit, and render. So these are the 3 props I have to provide for this to work. Right now, it's breaking on something else, so let's not worry about that. So we're going to say you're going to receive inputs, you're going to receive something for your submit functionality, and you're going to receive something for render. So first inputs, what data type does it need to be? An object. And now we get to choose what are our inputs going to be for this form that we created. Well, we already decided, title and description. So you'll have a title and a description. Next, submit. Well, we're going to be calling this when we click handle submit. It's going to call this function and give it the inputs. So when it calls this function and give it the inputs, we're going to receive the inputs right here as a callback function, and so we can do something with them and call our own function. So when we click submit, what we really mean is take those inputs and pass them into my own function, like props.addToDo, and give it those inputs. This is from the provider we made earlier. So it's going to receive those inputs as the new to-do object and add it to our state. Lastly, render is also a function being called, right? It's being called right here, and it's providing an object as well, just like submit is providing an object as well. Well, this object has all the functionality plugged in, ready to go. So we're going to take our form props and pass them down to our actual to-do form. Now, to-do form is receiving all of our form props. What are the props being provided? There's 3 of them. Handle change, handle submit, and inputs. Inputs has a dot title and a dot description because when I set it up, I said that's what your input should be. And then it provides those plugged into everything to our form. So I don't need the word inputs. I don't want to say inputs.title, inputs.description. So you can destructure a nested object by saying colon, object brackets, give me title and description.
So maybe like an app, do you have to-do form already or you're not using it yet?
Yeah, I got it right here.
Oh, I see. Sorry, I didn't see that.
Oh, you're good. So we'll plug everything into what it needs to be tied to. Cannot read property inputs of undefined. Oh, I did that wrong, didn't I? We just say props.inputs here. Okay, and our form is up. This is the only time that I ever pass props through the constructor and super is if we need to set state off of it. Because this .props doesn't exist until the constructor is finalized. So let's see if this works. Newest, sure. Submit. New set. And add more to-dos. So let's follow the train of logic here. Join me on the train. That's weird. Okay, we call form. Form is a function that takes in 3 props. First, it takes in inputs. It receives those inputs via props and creates state to have a .inputs equal to that object. So now state is title description. It then sets up the handle change to be able to update inputs depending on where the user is typing. Next, it receives a submit prop that we're saying should be a function that receives inputs and then forwards those inputs to one of our functions. So it receives those inputs and our submit callback, and it ties into our handle submit to call that function and pass in the inputs when it's called, causing this chain reaction for the inputs to show up here, and we can pass them forward. Lastly, it calls this.props.render, which is an object with 3 properties. When we call render, it provides that object, and we then tell it what component to return with that functionality. It's a lot of setup work, but now I'd never have to write another form for the rest of my application as far as the functionality goes. I can still write new static forms to receive the functionality, but this is done. Yeah, so if I do this, I'm now calling that function again, and it's creating a new piece of state. So I can give it new inputs, tell it what to do on submit, and tell it what type of form to render. So we're not doing this right now, but this is user authentication. If we wanted to use this, username, password, let's just look at this conceptually for a moment. Submit would receive those inputs and pass them to props.login maybe. And the render would take our form props and render the login form. And then we also need to make our sign up form. So we just copy that, still gets the same inputs, but instead it should call sign up when submit is called, and it should load the sign up form. And now I have 3 different forms with 3 different states with all their own functionality right here, if these actually existed. Questions? This is so eerily quiet.
So we still have to have individual parts for
Yeah, I still need the forms that receive the functionality and use it, but I don't ever have to write my class again, my handle change, my handle submit. That's all ready to go. I just need to tell it how to work. Now, is this the only way to make a render prop form? Always fear from saying I found the way to do it. This is not the only way to do it. Depends on the type of form you have. If this had checkboxes, I'd have to change some things about my handle change. So it could handle checkboxes as well. Things like that. And maybe I want my forms to be very nice and like have autofocus and all these types of things for the inputs. I have to add all that to this form, so each form I create have that nice UI added to it. I'm gonna paste that below. I heard an O. That sounds good. It's like, no, 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 no. Don't do it. So much to live for. No. Just let it think for a second. Okay. Some more examples down here. Okay, one last note, if you're using multiple contexts, how does it work? We won't need to build another context. Let's say we had a user provider as well that provides our user object and has like our sign up and login functions and a user context.provider and a with user higher order component. Well, all we'd have to do is add to what we already have. We could import the user provider from our context user provider. We would wrap it around our app. And then we go to our app, and now we need to consume our to-dos, but we also need to consume our user provider. So just like I imported with to-dos, I'd import with user from the user provider, and I'd say give me everything. And just keep expanding the syntax. As long as to-dos and user don't have shared names of what they're providing, everything from the user provider, everything from the to-dos provider will all show up in props here. There's no different if you're using multiple or one. You just keep expanding on the syntax, but it's the exact same way. Yeah, I can do this on any component, or I can do one or the other, just depending on what I need. So this will make sure everything from both of these are in props, but if I only did one of them, then I'd just be getting the user data in props, or vice versa, if that's what you're saying.
I was thinking of like another component, apps, like maybe back.
Yeah, like we had a to-do list or something.
Yeah.
Inside of this component, we could do this as well, or we could just do one or the other. But it's going to be fine because we said give the ability for our entire app to be able to consume wherever needed by wrapping it here. I'm just going to comment these out so we can see what the syntax looks like. Okay, we're back.